Welcome to day 117 of our journey through the Bible. Our attention is going to go to the book of Ezekiel today. But before we read from Ezekiel, I'd like to take us to the New Testament and read from Peter's letter, 1 Peter chapter 1, beginning with verse 10. Concerning this salvation, the prophets who prophesied about the grace that was to be yours searched and inquired carefully, inquiring what person or time the Spirit of Christ in them was indicating when he predicted the sufferings of Christ and the subsequent glories. It was revealed to them that they were serving not themselves, but you, and the things that have now been announced to you through those who preach the good news to you by the Holy Spirit sent from heaven, things into which angels long to look. Just a word about the prophetic ministry of these men in the Old Testament that we're studying that we need to keep in mind. Many times as they would speak, they were given a vision by God, but it was an encompassing vision that included things that would be happening even in their lifetime, in the immediate future, as well as things that would happen at the coming of Christ and his incarnation when he came born in a manger and lived and died on a cross for us. And then also in that same picture, there were pictures of his final return and the end of the years. And in many cases, it was like taking a picture of a large vista, maybe of a mountain range with a telephoto lens. There's a foreshortening. Things on the picture themselves can look a lot closer together than they actually are. And often the prophets themselves would look at these matters and be mystified by them. And yet, eventually it would be revealed what they were talking about and what God had given them would be not for them, but for future generations. That's certainly true in some of what Ezekiel will say, as well as some of the prophets we've already looked at. Well, let's focus today on Ezekiel. He was a prophet of a priestly family, and he was carried as a captive to Babylon in 597 BC. He was about 25 years old. His call to the prophetic ministry came 5 years later. Ezekiel prophesied to the captives who dwelt by the river Shebar at Tel Abib. In his book, he identifies himself as a priest. He is married to a woman who was, he says, the desire of his eyes. I think one of the saddest notes of his life has to be the death of his wife. In Ezekiel chapter 24, the first two verses, the prophet was told that on the very day he received his revelation, his wife would die as the armies of Babylon laid siege against the holy city of Jerusalem. Ezekiel's sadness at the death of his wife was to match the grief of God at the sin of Jerusalem. In fact, Ezekiel was commanded not to grieve her death. He was to steel himself for this tragedy, even as God had prepared himself for the death of his beloved city. Perhaps there's no other event in the lives of the Old Testament prophets that is as touching as this. The harshness of God's command to his prophet emphasizes the Lord's grief over the fate and the suffering of his rebellious people. Believers in God have been called upon to suffer many indignities through the ages. But in the suffering of Ezekiel, we learn something of the suffering of God himself. Ezekiel shows us just how ugly and serious our sin is. Our rebellion brings grief and hurt to God, against whom ultimately all of our sin is directed. Do you see why this helps us understand why God has acted so dramatically in the way that he had to deal with the sin of men by sending his own precious son, Jesus, to die in our place and to set us free from the bondage of sin? The book of Ezekiel uses vivid, symbolic language, much like the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. The New Testament received his prophetic messages from God in a series of visions. He addressed these prophecies to the Jewish exiles in Babylon. Although Ezekiel is a long book of 48 chapters, it has a logical, orderly structure, what makes it fairly easy to analyze and understand in terms of the overall layout of the book. After a brief introductory section about Ezekiel and the nature of his mission, the book falls naturally into four main divisions, and we'll look at those tomorrow. Let me mention just the first chapter of the book, where he describes an amazing vision of God, which came to him at the very beginning of his ministry. He saw four living creatures, each of which had the faces of a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. Clearly visible above these strange creatures was the likeness of a throne, symbolizing the might and the power of God. The glory of the Lord was clearly visible to Ezekiel as he called the prophet to proclaim his message of judgment. This vision in the very first chapter sets the tone for the rest of the book. We'll return to Ezekiel tomorrow. There's much more to say. Let me read from that first chapter, beginning with verse 25. And there came a voice from above the expanse over their heads. When they stood still, they let down their wings. And above the expanse of their heads there was the likeness of a throne, an appearance like sapphire, and seated above the likeness of the throne was a likeness with a human appearance. And upward from what had the appearance of his waist I saw, as it were, gleaming metal, like the appearance of fire enclosed all around. And downward from what had the appearance of his waist I saw, as it were, the appearance of fire, and there was brightness around him, like the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud on the day of rain. So was the appearance of the brightness all around. Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard the voice of one speaking.